Alrighty then. Well, this is let's talk about the six boxes model, and it's a funny thing to be doing at this point because six boxes model has been around for a while. And when I was thinking about it, preparing for this, I realized that it's been quite a long time. I wanted to also let you know there's a couple of articles you can download here, and I will make them available here. I'm going to share both of them, and you can. I think you can see over on the right side of your screen where you can do them. There are a couple of things that I wrote. There was an article in '98, which was about the six boxes model after about a decade of its having emerged, and talks a little bit about how it emerged. And so it's not a bad piece actually. And then there's a white paper we did about, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago. It's a little bit more too. And they're just useful things perhaps to have, copies of. I think this will be a more useful thing though, because we're going to sort of update you. But I think you can download those now, if I'm not mistaken. So, when I was thinking about doing this presentation, I thought, man, it's been a long time. Here's a picture of me, if you can believe it, when I was in my 30s, which is when this work started. I'll be 73 in a few weeks, so it's been going on for a while. And it's interesting to consider because this year, 2022, at the International Society for Performance Improvement Conference, Scott Wirsing, who has been in the ISPI world for quite a long time, he hosted a session. And in that session, he had people sort of nominate and then vote on the best performance model in the world. And guess what? The six boxes model won with 68% of the votes. Now, this was a fairly small sample, and I don't take it very seriously because when I think about my predecessors, the great thought leaders in this field, like Tom Gilbert and Gary Rumler and others, there's been brilliant work. And so I think it's a little bit overstated to talk about our simple model being the best performance model in the world. But I think it does make a point, which is that people have found it useful and accessible. And that's really what I want to talk about here. I want to talk a little bit about where this all came from, where the six boxes model emerged from, what the rationale was, why we did it. And a lot of folks who've been through our programs, of course, know this stuff, but many don't, and this will sort of lay down the record, I think. The second thing is I want to talk about how that emerged beyond just the six boxes model into what we now call performance thinking, and then talk a little bit about the applications, the variety of applications, because as you'll see, I and our expanding really global network of practitioners and people who use this, to think of it as kind of a Swiss Army knife for performance. And then there's some interesting challenges, both sort of in the community, in the marketplace, out in the world, and also in enabling people to use this most effectively. And then hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. So I want to start out with what I often refer to at the beginning of our programs as our mission. I was a student with B.F. Skinner at Harvard, and I'm probably one of the remaining live ones because I'm kind of old now. But the reason I went to study with Skinner after he actually invited me to was that I had gotten very enthusiastic when I read some of his work, and I realized the power of his science was enormous, that we could make big impacts in education, therapy, management, you name it, if we applied it. But of course, it was an arcane science, relatively speaking. And so the mission that I've been on since I was probably 21 or 22 was to make the findings of this science and also the power of what Tom Gilbert called performance engineering accessible to people, make it usable, make as many people be able to apply and benefit from it as possible. Now, these three people are among the major contributors to the work that I've done and were each mentors to me. Dr. Skinner, I've already mentioned. He created this natural science. He basically discovered a natural science of behavior and then developed a whole field. Og Lindsley was one of his main proteges who brought the science from the laboratory into education, primarily in the form of a field known as precision teaching, in which I was very deeply involved in the 70s and 80s. And then Tom Gilbert, who was a friend of Og Lindsley and who was for a short time a postdoc with Dr. Skinner, talked about performance engineering in the world of work. And so you'll see Gilbert had an enormous impact, but on the work that we're going to talk about. But Og Lindsley had an impact on me over 30 years of being a friend and mentor in a very specific way related to this topic, which is that when he moved from the laboratory at Harvard Medical School, which was pretty, science and had its jargon and was very academic in many respects, but brilliant work. When he moved into the field of education, he started working with teachers who didn't have any background in behavior science. And so he made a point of taking the language of behavior science and making it plain English, coming up with plain English equivalents. Because his point of view was, and I think it makes perfect sense, if you're going to speak with people, you better speak in a language that they can understand. He was shot down in the Second World War behind enemy lines and escaped from Nazi prison camps. And he used to talk about parachuting behind enemy lines when you're going into another field that you're trying to change. And so you got to learn the language. And in his case, he created a plain English language. Now, another influence of Dr. Lindsley was that he introduced me to the work of Steve Jobs and Apple Computer and all that in the late 70s. Ogden Lindsley was an early adopter of the Apple II. And of course, as everyone pretty much knows, one of the things that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak did was they took this sort of highly technical gizmo-like technology and turned it into a thing that you could have in your kitchen and use to put your recipes in, or you could use at work to do accounting and so forth. And there's a great book that I always recommend to people by Ken Segal, who worked with Jobs at both Apple and also at Next Computer, called Insanely Simple. You can see it there. And it's a quick read, but it talks about how Steve Jobs drove the value of simplicity into everything, their products, the way they did meetings, you name it. Simplicity was a really important value. And so I kind of picked up on that early on in my career. That combined with Lindsley's notion of using plain English, as you'll see, were a big driving force in all of this work. Now, if you go back to Skinner, Skinner's work was a science of behavior. And so he had this framework that was, some people call it the three-term contingency, or they call it the operant equation. There's different words, but the little letters at the top are really what he had. Discriminative stimuli, or SDs, which are the things that prompt or cue or establish the occasion for responding. And then R, which is response or behavior, which may come under the control of those antecedents, those stimuli, and then followed hopefully by reinforcing stimuli, SR plus, although sometimes punishment, etc. But the point is, that was his simple framework. And not too long after that had become part of the science of behavior, some applied people talked about ABC, and actually Ogden Lindsley had some influence in this. Antecedents, behavior, and consequences is a kind of a standard plain English way that people talk about this, that antecedents are the things that come before behavior, and they set the occasion for it, and then behavior occurs, and then consequences, if they're effective, will actually change the likelihood of that behavior. So that was a simple model that was used in the laboratory for what's called functional analysis, where Skinner and his proteges and students and the whole network of scientists that he spawned, if you will, systematically looked at conditions in the environment, looked at organisms, as they would say, and arranged conditions to see what would happen and measure the effects. So this was behavior science. Now, Gilbert, who actually was early on a contributor in the program instruction, program learning field, had a very famous book that probably everybody here knows about. And if you don't, it's called Human Competence. And I'll be referring to it again later. But what he said is, in the world of work, or in the real world, it's a somewhat different story. It's not that simple. Because in the laboratory, even though there are individual differences between all the white Carnot pigeons or rhesus monkeys or rats that you might have in the laboratory, fundamentally, they're viewed as kind of naive subjects. But what he said, in the world of work, it's a different story. So he created what he called the behavior engineering model. And he published it in his book in 1978, and very famous and very widely adopted and used by people. And what he said is that there's two levels of this. You can line it up with the three terms in Skinner's framework, but he talked about antecedents or discriminative stimuli as being about information, and then the response was about the capacity to respond and also the environmental factors that enabled you to respond. And then there were consequences, which were motivational factors in his view. But what he said is the environment arranges some conditions. It gives you what he called data. It gives you instruments, and it hopefully provides incentives. But that the individual or the person brings to the table their particular repertoire, or what's often referred to as knowledge. You could think of it as information that they carry around rather than that comes from the environment. And then capacity, which I think is a funny word, although if you understand it at the level of the individual, you realize what he meant was, what's the capacity of this individual to actually do whatever it is we're asking them to do? Are they strong enough to be, a dock worker? Are they analytical enough to be an accountant or whatever it is? So in other words, how do we match people to the jobs or tasks we ask them to do? And then motives was Skinner's way of doing what was called in the behavior science functional definition or analysis of consequences. In other words, if you give me an incentive that I don't care about, it's not going to work. So we need to understand the individuals or the groups or the culture's motives so we can understand what they're likely to, what's likely to be reinforcing, to use Skinner's term. So this was his framework, and I encountered it. One of my other mentors, Eric Houghton, gave me a copy of Human Competence in about 1980. And I didn't read it too much, but until about 1982 or 3, when I began to work in the corporate world, and I was working in sales performance. And what we did is we had some very, very powerful methods and tools for building fluent sales knowledge, which are sort of down in the knowledge box there. But what we recognized was that in order to implement the programs we had, some of which required self-study, but also to ensure the performance out in the field, we were going to have to look at those other cells in Tom's model, and we we're going to have to be sure that the right stuff was in place to ensure the actual performance would occur. So I and my colleagues in the early 80s really loved this framework. We said, this is fantastic. We can look at this whole system. But what happened was we began to want to share and partner with our colleagues, with our clients primarily, and they just didn't get the language. Like instruments. What are instruments? What is that? Is that an ohm meter, or is that a personality test, or what is that? Well, of course, it meant the things and the physical things and the other things in the environment that enable you to respond. Or data. That's the first cell in the box in the model. Like, what is that? Is that spreadsheets or databases or whatever? And so the language in Tom's model, even though it was elegantly summarized in single word labels, just wasn't working too well. And I'll actually show you examples later of people who encountered the same issue, I think, that I did, whereas that they said, these words aren't communicating very well with the people we want to communicate with. So let's try some other stuff. And so what happened was I began that process in the mid-'80s to try other language. And by the end of the 80s, we had arrived at this language. And it's very user tested. That is probably what's unique about it. It's two things. First of all, it's plain English. What we sought were words that people could pretty much understand easily from the get-go. They wouldn't have to have an interpretation. Would have to say, what does expectations mean again? Most people would understand that. And secondly, what we wanted was for people to not make category errors in the beginning. So when we finally got to this version, we had been sort of checking it out formally as we train people, informally as we talk to people about performance opportunities or improvement things. And what would happen is I remember countless times, and most of you have heard me talk about this, I think, but where somebody would ask me, hey, Dr. Binder, can you work on this with me, or can you give me some advice? And I would sit down with them in a few minutes, sketch out on an envelope or a piece of paper or even a napkin this model, and write in the labels and talk about them a little bit. And people say, okay, that makes sense, And then, for example, I remember one distinct time I came back about 2 weeks later, and this fellow who I'd done that with on a napkin actually had the napkin up on his cubicle wall. He said, I've been using that. And he said, for example, we were going to do a training program to build skills and knowledge, but we realized that we could make that a lot more efficient and shorter if we gave him good tools in the form of a job aid. So we had enough experiences like that, and enough experiences that were very different from our earlier experiences of trying to communicate with Tom Gilbert's language, that we changed this language and we said, we've got it. And so expectations and feedback are all the information that set expectations for how you're supposed to perform and what you're supposed to produce. And those can go all the way from the very highest cultural and organizational and societal expectations down to what your supervisor tells you or a job aide tells you and everything in between. And feedback are all the mechanisms in your environment that provide feedback about how you're doing. Again, from very high level down to immediate level feedback of, don't step on that again because there's a nail in it, that kind of thing. So everything that fits into that cell is about expectations and feedback. And then tools and resources is a much bigger kind of conceptual framework, I think, than the word instruments, because we're not just talking about devices, software, hardware. We're also talking about things like job design, processes that you use, people, having access to people that will function as resources. So those are all the things that as a performer you use or need while you're performing to be effective. And then consequences and incentives are not meant to be negative and positive consequences. They're meant to be consequences are things that happen after behavior that affect the likelihood of that behavior happening again, either more or less. And incentives are ones you know about in advance. Incentives are where they say, if you do this, you'll get this. So that's all of the stuff about reinforcing or punishing consequences. And then on the bottom row, skills and knowledge expand a little bit on the notion of just knowledge, but it's the existing repertoire that somebody brings to the table or that they need to develop, possibly through training or experience or mentoring or what have you. Selection and assignment, we changed that, although we left the word capacity in there because some people still liked capacity because they knew about Gilbert, but a lot of people misinterpreted capacity as being organizational capacity. And we're talking about the individuals here. So how do you select and assign people to fit jobs? And even though that sort of doesn't sound like the individual, what we find is that people get that really fast, and they get this is about how we put people in the right spots. And then finally, motives and preferences are not only the way we find out about what consequences might work for a person, but it's about lining people up with the value, finding out what their values are, figuring out how they like expectations and feedback presented, for example, and all the rest of it. So this was the model that we basically developed in about probably it was done by about 87, 88. I don't remember the exact dates. And so we were using this fairly consistently to train people and introduce to people and so forth. But it was a little bit complicated because I wanted to pay homage to Tom Gilbert, but I wanted to be accurate and precise. And so I would stumble over this and I'd say, well, you can see this is kind of related to Tom Gilbert's model, but most of the words are different, And so there was a few years there where I was always a little bit awkward in front of a group of people talking about it. So Tom Hogan, who was a very sort of wise, shrewd, wonderful character, actually, who was a client at Dun & Bradstreet, I was in front of a room talking to a team of people who were becoming sales performance consultants because he was head of sales training at the time at Dun & Bradstreet. And I was talking about it and I was stumbling over the things. And he said, why don't you just call it the 6 boxes? You always talk about the cells and boxes of that model. So I said, okay, so we can do that. So a few years later, we wound up trademarking it and so forth for reasons you'll see. But that's where the name came from. It came from a client, basically, a smart one. And it worked. It really did work. What we began to find is that we could introduce this model to people and they could use it in a variety of ways. And they didn't make big mistakes. And not only that, but it spread like a virus. And I think that's why that 2022 thing where it says, best in the world. I'm not sure if it's the best in the world, but it's easy to communicate. People get it, no matter what their background is. So that was a big deal. Now, as a result of all of that, and as a result of the influence of Og Lindsley and Steve Jobs, and just my understanding about user experience during that period, what we began to recognize was we better look carefully at how we communicate with our clients and colleagues, because we want to make things simple and plain English. That was a big sort of, for me, earth-shaking change that happened over a period of time. But, and Gilbert strikes again, because as I went deeper into this field and as I became deeply involved in the International Society for Performance Improvement, Gilbert, to me, was the shining light here, along with Joe Harless, his probably most important protege. And Gilbert made this earth-shaking statement in his book. He said, in the great cult of behavior, Behavior is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. But we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. So this changed a lot. Not everybody moved with it, but the idea was if we focus on the valuable products of behavior and then identify the behavior needed to produce them, we will be focusing on the value delivered in organizations, the value delivered by people, and so forth. So that had a huge impact on me and many, many others. And the field of performance improvement, or human performance technology, as it was called at the time, really kind of exploded. And there were all kinds of models and people were really getting into it. We called accomplishments work outputs, again, for the same reason that we wanted plain English, because when we looked up the word accomplishments, even though it's a really attractive word, it sounds good, it sounds valuable and all of that. If you look in the dictionary, there are more definitions of accomplishment that are about completion of behavior than there are things produced by behavior. And so we coined the phrase work outputs so there would be no little misunderstandings. These are things, and they're countable things that come sometimes more than one at a time. So that was an example of the plain English thing. But the other piece to this, because I'm not going to talk much about accomplishments, was that, as I said, this work and the work of Gary Rumler and some others sort of spawned this whole field that produced an awful lot of models. Now, this is just one of them. I often refer to it as the everything, including the kitchen sink model, because it was actually on the International Society for Performance Improvement's website for quite a few years. And if you look in there, there's kind of everything you could do about instruction and performance. It's all there. But I had a lot of clients who would have that on the wall, or they'd be talking about it, and they say, this is kind of complicated. What do we do with this? This is and then you'd get the business people, the stakeholders, and they'd see this. If you showed it to them, they'd say, "Whoa, how long is this going to take? Is kind of analysis paralysis? What do we do with this?" And the other thing is that I noticed the field of performance improvement, just a big soup is a phrase that some people use, but the idea was there are all these different models and variations and use of terminology, and depending on who you spoke with, they'd pull out this model or that model or whatever. So it was not likely to spread consistently as a thing. So that led us to do another simple model that we call the performance chain. And what we said is you could boil all that stuff down that we just saw in the complicated model, but ultimately when we're looking at performance, human performance of any kind, we're talking about these four things. We're talking about behavior influences, which is the realm of the 6 boxes model, all the things, all the variables that affect behavior. And then performance itself is behavior, activity, that produces valuable accomplishments or work outputs that are valuable because they contribute to organizational or business results, or maybe societal results. So we sort of pulled out from the work of Gilbert and especially Joe Harless, this simple framework. And the examples and types underneath you can not pay attention to right now, but that's the second model that we use. And that also has worked very nicely. Most people get it pretty quickly, although there's some more difficult parts than others. Now, can you explain the difference between the following terms? I'm not sure what terms they are, but feel free to list them. So then, in addition, by combining these two things, the 6 boxes model, which is the way we frame needs assessment, needs analysis. I have no idea, Marianne. I'd love to know the difference. I think people use those words in a lot of different ways, so I don't have a good answer to you. I'm not an expert. I talk about performance analysis, and I don't even talk about needs very much, to be perfectly honest, but that's a word that a lot of people do use. So what we did then, in terms of a methodology or a thing to teach people, we came up with this thing we call performance improvement logic, which is how we do it. And so we just basically pasted these two models together, the performance chain, which describes the elements of performance in ways that can be defined fairly precisely, and the 6 boxes model, which provides the universe of things that might influence it. And we said, okay, we got to start in any given project or coaching session or you name it. What's at stake here for the organization? Is this about revenue or profit or customer satisfaction or whatever? Okay, once we kind of know that, then let's take a look at the performance in question and figure out what the accomplishments or work outputs are, whether it's a process or an individual role or what have you. And we also want to be sure that, as that little orange circle points, that there is a credible connection between the work outputs and the business results. We don't have to do an experiment, but we can usually make a credible connection between whether it's the decision or a relationship or a deliverable. This is a valuable thing. So then we say, okay, now let's focus on figuring out what the behavior is needed to produce the work outputs. And once we've done that, we can measure, because we can measure business results, which tend to be lagging indicators. We can measure behavior, which is expensive to measure, but very useful for diagnosis and feedback. And we can count work outputs. So that's the measurement part. And then we kick into the 6 boxes. We say, okay, now that we have identified the performance, we know the behavior that produces the work outputs that contributes to results. Let's analyze, brainstorm, and choose behavior influences. And I'll unpack that a little bit later. But let's use the 6 boxes model to understand what's working and what's not working. And let's try to improve the conditions for performance. And then whatever it is we come up with at the end of that conversation or discussion or effort, we implement, measure, and adjust in a continuous fashion. Now, we also, with our model, do another thing, which is because there's literally, if you count them, there's 2 pictures. There's the performance chain and the 6 boxes model, and there's 21 plain English words in there, and that's it. And so what we found is that we can begin fairly early on to engage our clients, our colleagues, our stakeholders, our proteges at any level pretty much in understanding and sharing our perspective about performance. And one of the things we learned early on with our clients, this started to emerge in the early 2000s, was we would be teaching people about this or working with them about it. And they said, this gives us a way to think differently. You know, we're now looking at performance through these models, and this is really powerful. Now we think differently about performance. That's really what you're teaching us, beside giving us tools and so forth. So we actually, as you'll see, we sort of used the phrase performance thinking ultimately to name our methodology in our company. And what we learned was, with this plain language that was user tested, and these 2 simple pictures, as opposed to big, complicated sort of academic pictures, we could engage anybody. We do executive coaching, and we work with frontline supervisors with high school education and everybody in between. And what we learn is that anybody can pick this up. And so the original mission of communicating and enabling and giving people access to the fundamentals of performance engineering, behavior science is available through this. That at least has been our experience. Now, let me talk a little bit about how we use the 6 boxes model, because I think this is fairly widely known, although my observation in the field of performance improvement is that people tend to use Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model primarily as a kind of a diagnostic, very often in things like root cause analysis, or they're trying to figure out what's the problem, you know. And we've, I think, go considerably beyond that. In fact, we think of this as a kind of a Swiss Army knife. If you combine the 2 models, if you look at the performance thinking, the logic that I just laid out, you can pretty much apply it to almost any kind of performance. But the first thing it does, this is a job aid that we give out, and you probably can't read it that well, but this is the best we could do probably 25 years ago or so, taking in the fewest possible bullet points all the factors in each of these cells that represent the optimal conditions. So if all these things are working in the way that are described, you got a pretty complete, positive, integrated system of behavior influences. And the flip side to that is, these are the negative versions of that. So we use this as a way to look at opportunities. You say, oh, wait a minute, the expectations and feedback are all out of whack, you know, or the consequences are not lined up with expectations, or people don't have any fluency in the skills and knowledge, so no wonder they can't do what they're doing, or whatever it is. If you look through these, this is a way we use this when we're looking for opportunities for improvement. We also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we teach this ABC, which is different from antecedents, behavior, and consequences. This came in about 15 years ago in our work, because what we noticed was that people would be using the 6 boxes model, and they would say, oh, there's a problem here. And they would immediately jump to some kind of solution. It was like the usual suspects. And so we wanted to slow people down a little bit. And also one of my great mentors, late mentor, Don Toasty, who was a really important contributor in the behavior science world and in its application and in performance improvement. We always used to talk about the fact that performance improvement done well is what he referred to as a design engineering discipline. It's about optimizing systems. And part of that is because the field of performance improvement came out of, and the reason it was called human performance technology early on, HPT, was because it came out of instructional technology. And so a lot of the early giants, thought leaders in the field of human performance technology had come from program instruction, program learning, instructional systems design. And what they were trying to do is optimize the instructional system so people would learn as much as fast as they could. So it was an optimization design exercise. But when the process and quality kind of work kicked in about the 80s and later, 70s and 80s, people were looking for why the widget was coming off the end of the assembly line with a defect. So it very much shifted to root cause analysis and problem solving. It's like, how come that thing's broken? We got to fix it. And so what happened was there tended to be this thing where people were looking for the factor or maybe a few factors that caused the problem. And then they would sort of, ameliorate that, fix that in some way. And my take on it, and the conversations I had with Don Toasty were, that's like saying we just want to plug the hole in the dike as opposed to building a better dike. And our perspective is we want to build a better dike. So if you go back to the 6 boxes model, the way we approach it is if you've got some behavior that's producing outputs, but it's not working the way you'd like it to, first of all, let's use the cells in the 6 boxes model to see what's working and what's not working or missing in each cell. So we analyze the existing behavior influences, pluses and minuses. Then, and this is kind of the design thinking part, this is the ideation part. Then we say, based on what we've learned talking to successful performers, based on, conversations with people, based on publications, best practices, evidence-based practices, you name it, we brainstorm as many different ways to fix those things that are missing and working against performance as we can. So this is where we say, slow down for a moment. Don't just jump to job aids or don't just jump to the usual solutions. Let's see what a creative set of options might be. And then ideally with our stakeholders, let's choose what the best configuration is. So this is the process, if you will, the thought process that we use when we're actually configuring performance systems or performance designs or interventions using the 6 boxes model. Now, if you follow that logic, you can do just about anything. As I said, it's a Swiss Army knife in a way. But what we've identified over the years is that if you're applying this overall methodology, where you're starting out with accomplishments or work outputs, and then you're applying the 6 boxes, is you can do all these things. First of all, you can do anything that involves with defining, improving, and supporting the performance of individuals, roles, job titles, or whatever. You can look at their performance, what are their outputs, what do they need to produce it, and then optimize the 6 boxes. You can do the same thing with a process, because a process should be defined as a series of steps, each one of which has an output that can be defined as whether it's good or not. And then we can look at each of those steps and we can optimize the conditions for the behavior needed to produce it. We can also, if we are working with people whose kind of core, who kind of live in the training box, so to speak, one of the things we know is that if training is done in a spray and pray approach where you just train them, and hope it's going to work, like police chiefs do with their policemen or whatever, and then you say, well, they're killing people, we better retrain them. That ain't going to work. What we know is we've got to look at the outputs and the behavior, and then not only the skills and knowledge, but especially the top row in the 6 boxes. What are the expectations and feedback? What tools, processes, resources, et cetera, do they have? What are the consequences for stuff? And so you can begin with training, but if you want to optimize return on investment for training, you want to be sure you look at all the boxes to be sure it works. And that's a big part of the argument or the persuasive effects that we try to do with stakeholders or business people when they say, oh, just give us training, that's all we want. We say, well, wait a minute, you may need some training here, but if you don't support that with the other cells in this model, it's probably not going to pay off. And then the fourth one is sustaining and supporting implementation and change management. Now, there's a lot of implementation science and change management methodologies out there. My observation is that they have some strong pieces. There's stuff about change agents and getting very clear on the mission and a bunch of stuff. But a lot of times there's not much as far as sustaining change. And so again, if you look at the 6 boxes, you want to put in place all the factors likely to sustain the new behavior, the new performance. And so we can do that too with this. We can also, and this is a little bit obscure, but we can do organizational culture work with this too, because if you have practices that you would like your people in your organization to practice more, you can arrange behavior influences and get very specific about what it is you'd like them to do, produce. And finally, what we've known for years, and it's funny because we just added this as a sixth type a while ago. I started out in sales enablement, but sort of circled back, and we're doing more of that work now, is that sales performance is a kind of a hybrid thing, because it's a process to some extent. You're going from, initial contact to selling something, but it's not a strict linear process like, for example, manufacturing might be. So we look at it a little bit differently. Anyway, these are all the kinds of domains or applications that you can do with this, where the 6 boxes model is the critical piece. And there's not too many things that fall outside these, I think. The other thing, and this is a little controversial, I was hoping my colleague Roger Addison would be here, is there's a lot of discussion about, about levels of analysis improvement in organizations. For example, people talk about worker, workplace, worker, workplace, and world, or they talk about individual, process, organizational, and societal. Well, people often have different vocabularies for those different levels. And they'll say, well, the 6 boxes model or Gilbert's behavior engineering model is just for individuals. Well, it's not true. And I've worked with a lot of people. We've looked at societal issues. We've looked at social justice issues. We've looked at big processes, organizational issues. You can fit things from all levels of analysis into the expectations box, for example. Policies are a way of setting expectations, among other things. They don't have to be a different category. They're expectations. So I used to be a little hesitant about this, but now it's very clear to me that anything that influences human performance at any level can be sorted into these 6 boxes. And it actually makes sense because it makes them all hang together in your analysis and design work. One of the main applications, I would say, underlying a lot of what we do with the 6 boxes model is to optimize return on investment. Because the first thing is, as I've kind of implied a couple times, if we just do 1 or 2 things in those cells of the model, and we don't pay attention to the other factors, we're not going to get the best payoff. It may not sustain. So we want to get the best value by optimizing how the pieces all fit together. We also, for example, training. A lot of the people I work with, and people probably likely to watch this webinar, come from a training and development history. And so, let's train them. Well, okay. First of all, if we don't do the other stuff, training's probably not going to stick. But more importantly, there's a lot of times when you can do things like say, well, this person needs new skill. But if their supervisor or manager sets really clear expectations and gives frequent feedback, they will learn that skill. And you don't have to take them out of the job to go train them in many cases. Or if you give people a really good job aid, it's well designed, and you be sure they use it, and you set expectations, you give them feedback, you can get skills and knowledge. So looking at the broader set of behavioral influences allows you to often get less expensive interventions. You also can use the 6 boxes as a framework for repeated looking at and continuously improving things. We never get it right the first time. We might have a lot of stuff going on, but we might, you implement something and then you come back 6 weeks and you say, oh my gosh, look, we missed that. And so you can continuously improve and tighten up the factors that influence people's behavior to produce valuable work outputs. And that's where sustainment comes in. We have colleagues at a giant biotech company who added an explicit sustainment step in their projects where they talk to stakeholders and they say, when we implement, we're going to contract with you. We're going to agree up front that we'll come back 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever later, and we're going to do a quick and dirty 6 boxes analysis to find out what we missed, to find out what we can change, because we want to be sure that all the things are in place to sustain this performance. And the final thing is, because of the plain Englishness of it and the simplicity of the model, we can do what performance improvement professionals are always asked to do, which is to partner with people. I don't want to just parachute in and do something magical and disappear. I want to be able to have a conversation and a partnership with my clients, my stakeholders. And so that also optimizes ROI because we engage them in the effort. So that's a big piece of why and how we use the 6 boxes. It's also turns out when you're doing leadership, management, coaching, supervision, to be a powerful framework for teaching people what it really means to be a leader or manager. Because I'm sure a bunch of people here know, a lot of times you can, you can have people be put into management roles, and they kind of think they're supposed to be the smartest person in the room or whatever. You take a successful salesperson, you make them a sales manager, and they think they're supposed to be the closers, and that's not their job. If you're in a leader or manager role, your job is to arrange behavior influences to optimize both the productivity and the positive engagement of your people. And the 6 boxes model is a really powerful way to do that, because it allows you to look at all the factors. And in fact, something I left out of this presentation, but there's another webinar on our YouTube channel, performancethinking.tv, on employee engagement, because this framework lines up beautifully with the Gallup employee engagement poll or survey, which reflects the survey results of the Gallup 12-item survey are remarkably predictive of bottom line results, profitability, market share, customer satisfaction. And what we find is that those 12 items in the Gallup survey sort beautifully into the 6 boxes model. So we can help leaders and managers make that shift to saying, oh, wait a minute, my job is to help other people perform. And in fact, over the years, we've evolved this model, which is a model of best practices for leaders and managers. If you say their job is to help other people perform, this stuff, all these things in here, are the ways in which leaders and managers actually implement behavior influences with their people. John, who is actually here, I believe, with us still, I've known John Skank for many, many years. And he was, when I first met him, he was Senior Vice President of Sales at Dun & Bradstreet. And in fact, he was a friend of Tom Hogan, who named this thing. And back when we introduced this to John, one of the things he said, because this is a real senior guy, senior leader who was very experienced. This is no newbie, And what we found since then, and John was one of the first to ever say this to me, is what's beautiful about the 6 boxes framework is it gives us a way to put stuff we already know about. We know about compensation. We know about giving people tools. We know about setting clear expectations and feedback. And the 6 boxes model gives us a way to take all that stuff we know and add more. So I love that way of thinking about it because it's good for senior people, not just for beginners. We also have a model which focuses on outputs or accomplishments of defining performance. And this is just a quick look at it. Again, we have a webinar on our YouTube channel about accomplishment-based talent development. But this is the model we have in there. And at every step, once somebody's in the door, once you've brought people into the organization, you then are in a position where you can use the 6 boxes to design how you onboard them, how you train them to be ready for the job, how you coach them ongoing. And so the 6 boxes model, again, is a kind of a Swiss Army knife for helping people to develop. Now, those are just some of the things, but that gives you a flavor, I think, for some of the applications and such. But there's some challenges and some mistakes. And, one of the things is the 6 boxes model is way better than other stuff. Even if you just use it in a kind of a primitive way, you're probably going to be more effective than if you didn't have it in your toolkit. But if you really want the full power of it, there's a few things about it. And one of the things is that the 6 boxes thing is the easy part. If you're doing performance analysis, whether it's for an individual that you're trying to coach or supervise or some big whole organization, the 6 boxes is pretty easy. You look at what the factors are in each of the cells, you optimize them and so forth. That's pretty straightforward. And in fact, another one of our webinars, Get Out of the Training Box, this appeals to trainers because those trainers who are kind of held by their stakeholders into just give us training, please, they begin to have a way with the 6 boxes to begin having discussions in the other factors, not just skills and knowledge, that can help improve performance. So it's a very quick and dirty thing. And I think one of the reasons, again, for that voting of it's being, the best performance model in the world is because it's very easy to begin to have an impact using the 6 boxes model, even in a fairly primitive way. The hard part is the yellow stuff here. The hard part I find with humans is actually identifying what the accomplishments or work outputs are for an individual or a process, being sure that they connect up to business results, and then identifying the behavior. It's not impossible. It's a skill you can learn, but it's not right off. People don't get it right off the bat. There's in our programs, our practitioner programs for performance consultants, and our coaching and management programs, we take a lot of we require a lot of practice and feedback to get people to be good at this part. It's the hard part. And so you can imagine, to use Robert Frost's, two roads diverged. You can imagine which road's a lot easier. People go down that wide one with the 6 boxes at the end because it's pretty easy to apply. And they tend not to go up that hairy one that has you climbing over roots because it's a little more challenging and harder work to do that. And so one of the things I've observed over my quite a few years of working with this now, when I look out and see who's using the 6 boxes model for what, is they're so often using it without really defining the performance it's applied to very well. And so, what we need to do is we need to tell people, wait a minute, hold off on the 6 boxes. You got to do, first, let's do the hard work of defining performance. Let's go up that path. And once you got that, man, the 6 boxes becomes very straightforward, but you know what you're applying it to. You're applying it to the specific behavior that produces the valuable contributions or outputs that you need from your people. One of the reasons that we've shifted over the years in our branding, in our trademark, in our company name, and our methodological name from 6 boxes to performance thinking is that. Because we want people to understand the 6 boxes model is cool. It's a good thing. But until you really do both parts in this logic, it's not nearly as powerful as it can be. So we've changed the names of our programs. We've made our company the Performance Thinking Network because we think it's the whole thing. It's not just the 6 boxes model. So there's some typical mistakes, and this is the one I've always I've already referred to, which is, okay, well, we're going to apply the 6 boxes model. Well, to what? And very, very often I find people doing analyses in the 6 boxes without having explicitly defined the behavior and outputs that they're supposed to produce. And that just weakens the impact. The second one that's very common is people kind of pick their favorite words. They sort of say, well, okay, yeah, I like Gilbert's model and the 6 boxes model is kind of cool, but I like better words, so I'm going to use these ones. The problem with that is part of the power of our language, which really was user tested, is that it works. And so I'm not sure that these work as well, or that they even define what's supposed to be in those categories as well. And so what I find every once in a while, I encounter people who say, well, I like your model, but I changed the words. I was like, well, okay, but that's not the model, actually. It's different. And then the third one is, and this is not that uncommon, is when people look at the cells in the 6 boxes model as kind of separate lists. It's like, well, let's work on consequences. Well, okay, that might have some effect, but if it's not lined up with expectations, it's probably not going to work. And some of your tools might actually have unintended consequences, and we need to select people and be sure we understand they care about the consequences available. This is a system. And so when you look at it as just lists, it's not going to be all that effective. You got to look at the whole thing. The good part is that the top row of the 6 boxes, expectations, feedback, tools and resources, consequences and incentives, are very often pretty inexpensive to align and configure. Maybe sometimes you have to buy systems and that's expensive, but it doesn't have to be compensation in box 3. A lot of times it's just saying thank you at the right point, that kind of thing. So this is a system, and people often make the mistake of using it as kind of a set of lists. And then the last bit, there's been some misunderstandings here. And a few years ago, because I've been deeply involved in the field of performance improvement and ISPI for several decades, I was paying attention to literature a little bit, and I said, oh, this is kind of funky. People have different versions of what they say Gilbert's model is and so forth. So I wanted to look at it. So this is, you may recall, this is Tom's model. And this was what was published in his book, 1978 book, Human Competence. And this is the language of it, and this is how it's a page from his book. Well, okay, then how about Stolovich and Keeps? Notice that was 2004, so it was after I'd socialized the 6 boxes model a bit, and I don't know if they grabbed the language from me because these are not that hard, but notice they're saying this is Gilbert's behavior engineering model adapted, but it's different language than Tom. Tom called the whole third column motivation. Resources. Well, what about tools? So this is just some other words that they liked. And then stuns me actually. This article in 2003, notice it's flipped on its side. And the beauty of Tom's model from an intellectual and conceptual and scientific point of view was that those three columns lined up with Skinner's science. So now they've flipped these things. They've made it two columns. And it's like, well, okay, but it's kind of a drift, isn't it? Why are we doing that? And then this is one. Oh, yeah, look at the title from Boland. Got tools? Modified 6 boxes model. Well, if we look at the categories here, they're sure not the 6 boxes model that we have. It's somebody else's version of that word, and they have a dash in it. So that's kind of confusing to the reader. I think a lot of this is just stuff people want to put their own label on things. And then there's this, which is not bad actually, but it's still, so essentially this author did a reasonably good job of keeping more or less the same language, although they still didn't, because instrumentation is not what the second column in Tom's thing is. So it's another version. We're just kind of working at a conceptual level. And then Roger Chevalier updated the behavior engineering model. And again, you notice the words are different. And then he expanded that even further in another publication, The Evolution of a Performance Analysis Job Aid. And then this is the killer. This is a man who should know better. He's a scholar. He promotes himself as a big person in our field. He's made a big contribution. But in his publication, he talks about Gilbert's 6 boxes. Now, maybe I'm just being nitpicky about this, but to me, if you're going to be a scholar, if you're going to try to communicate, you ought to get the words right. And so to me, Tom Gilbert's model is the model that he published in 1978. And the 6 boxes model is the thing that we changed and trademarked and copyrighted. And there's a whole lot of other stuff, but I don't think you should be calling other stuff the behavior engineering model or the 6 boxes model. This is an accurate reference citation. This was from another article where they actually did cite it and show what the model is. So some years ago, because we saw all this happening out there, we registered trademarks for both 6 boxes and performance thinking. We copyrighted the 6 boxes model. And that's somewhat controversial because the International Society for Performance Improvement is kind of semi-academic. There's a lot of academics and people who, in certain academic worlds, you just kind of share it all and everybody is, has their version of it and so forth. And that's fine in science. But where you're trying to communicate efficiently and effectively to thousands of people to get them to actually apply what you're teaching them, it's good to be consistent. And so the first thing is the 6 boxes model is specific and user tested. And it absolutely is. The second thing is, if we do this, we may be correcting some of the shoddy scholarship that I just showed you, where people are just kind of being loose about it. We also want to strengthen methodological integrity. The words matter. If there's one example I've seen in my career about words matter, it's this, that the actual words in the cells of that model imply different things. And when we drill down into showing what's in each of the cells, it all lines up. Whereas if you look at some of the other things, it's kind of fuzzy. And it's like, if you're going to apply this, like, what does this mean? And then finally, from a branding point of view, in this open source marketplace, one of my other mentors and longtime colleagues, Bob Horn, who created the information mapping method, which is also a trademark methodology, he took a lot of flack back in, I guess, the 70s, I think, probably when he first did that. And he had to create his own term called structured writing to be the generic version of which information mapping was the trademark. But he took a lot of flack because, again, he was in this semi-academic world where people could kind of be loosey-goosey about stuff. But his point was, we have a methodology here, and it has a name, and this is what it is. And so that's the way we view the 6 boxes model. So I used to be defensive about this, but now I'm probably offensive because I just think we ought to get it straight if we're going to be good scholars and if we're going to actually acknowledge intellectual property and advances in the field and so forth. So there's a lot more stuff at performancethinking.com, which you can also get there from 6boxes.com, but we don't say that anymore because performancethinking.com is what we want to put forward. There's some white papers and some publications that you might find useful. We also have a YouTube channel, performancethinking.tv, and the recording of this webinar will be posted there. And there's a bunch of other stuff. It's starting to be a pretty good resource for people. We have free webinars. If you go to our website at performancethinking.com, you'll see the little thing where you can register or tell your friends to register for future webinars. And although it's probably a bit late to get anybody interested at this point, I just want to mention we run our open uh, performance thinking practitioner program every few months for individuals that want to show up versus the ones we do in-house for whole teams. And our next one is coming up September 13th, but pretty much the door will be closing in a few days. In fact, I think we've almost got it filled up now. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I would love to have any questions or comments from anybody if I haven't bored you with, if you have any thoughts, comments, questions. So, Miriam, I apologize if I can't be helpful with those terms, but those are examples of terms that mean different things to a lot of people. And so, as you can see, we have a very specific approach that we call performance improvement logic for analysis and development of interventions. But my observation has been that those words, performance analysis, performance assessment, and so forth, are used pretty differently by a lot of people. So does anybody have any comments, questions, observations? I can see you're still with us, at least. You haven't dropped out. So what do you think? Do you think, is there anything that I've just said? That's what you guessed. Yeah, you good guess. Yeah, what's your question? Oh, good deal. What are you thinking? Please write your question, if you will. While you're doing that, I'm interested in people, if you think it's unreasonable, for example, to have defined this thing, trademarked it and copyrighted. Okay, how would you approach the topic with a client who represents the training department? Okay, well, that's a really good question. So most of the people who we work with come from training and development. I mean, that's just a fact. Now, occasionally, like current thing I'm doing with a health care provider, I'm working with sales training and sales operations. And that's really nice because when you can have a vocabulary shared between sort of operations people and training people, it means they can begin to look through the same lens and stuff. But a few things to suggest. One is some training people can't get beyond competency modeling and whatever. So there are some training people that just are not responsive to any of this. But what I was going to say is that what I've found is when I work with teams of training people who are trying to become performance consultants, because that's classic. For example, at Amgen, which is our biggest and longest client, they've been using performance thinking, I think, for over a dozen years now. They've got almost 300 certified performance thinking practitioners around their global organization. It took them a few years to get where business stakeholders were now as they think of it as a strategic business advantage. But in the beginning, if you can get a few people who are interested and you can share the 6 boxes model with them, for example, and the way I typically do it with almost anybody is if I've got a new client, I will go in and have a meeting with them, or maybe I'll do it virtually, and ask them a lot of questions like, what are the business issues here? What have you tried? What's working? What's the problem? All the kind of typical front end consulting stuff. And then at some point I will say, can I use your whiteboard or can I use the screen and show you a little bit about how we think about performance? And you might find that helpful. And then I will start with the performance chain. I'll say, first, we want to know what the business results are that this is about, this training or whatever it is. And then we want to identify the valuable things that people produce that contribute to those results. And some of those are concrete deliverables. Some of them are things like relationships and decisions, but they're nonetheless outputs or contributions. And then we want to figure out what the best behavior is for producing those by talking to your people, by looking at some best practices, et cetera. And then look at the 6 boxes. We want to be sure that behavior happens. And so we're always looking at all the factors here. And I'll try to use examples from the client's world. Now, if the training person responds and says, yes, but our stakeholders won't let us touch that, that is a common experience that training people, and I suspect you've had that experience, they treat you as an order taker. And so it may be that you hit your head against the wall and it never works. But what I have experienced with that is I'm looking for people, whether I'm selling performance improvement or whether I'm trying to help people kind of evangelize inside of an organization, I'm looking for light bulbs to go on. And the first thing is that I've had almost nobody, including decision makers or business people, who thought the performance chain didn't make sense. If you talk through it in simple terms, they say, oh, yeah, this kind of makes sense. I get that. Same thing with 6 boxes. If you look at anybody who's had any experience with other humans, you can give enough examples in that model so they begin to say, oh, that's very interesting. So I can at least tell them how I think about it. And then my experience with training professionals is you say, okay, you kind of live down here in the skills and knowledge box, don't you? And they'll say, yeah, we do. And they say, well, sometimes you create tools though, right? Reference materials and job aids, and very often that's the case. And then I say, well, how do you set expectations for what you want people to do in your training and then on the job? And they'll say, whatever they say, I'll say, well, do you engage your stakeholders in that? Because when you pop out a new program, don't you at least want the stakeholders, the managers, the executives, whoever they are, to sort of say, yeah, this training's important and that's why, and we want you to do this, and this is how it's going to change your world. How about recognition? Is there any recognition for people who do super well, maybe new trainees or whatever? Let's look at your processes and tools. So my point is, you begin to have a conversation with decision makers about return on investment. And if there's anything they might be interested in, it's return on investment. The other thing in the last 5 to 10 years that I've found quite helpful is employee engagement. And these days, of course, with the great resignation going on, there's an awful lot of companies who are scrambling to hire and keep people. I have yet to talk to anybody in companies that doesn't have open seats. Everybody's disappearing somewhere. They're moving. So the conversation around engagement, the 6 boxes, is really powerful because you can say, think about your own work life and consider, you may have the skills and knowledge. You went through the training program. But if expectations and feedback aren't pretty clear and positive and consistent, or if your tools or processes or resources or time or whatever really are not helpful, get in the way, and if there's actually no recognition for what you're doing, you're not going to be too happy, are you? This whole attitude thing down here in box 6 is probably going to turn south, and you're going to stick around for the paycheck. But if something else comes along, you'll jump. Whereas if those things are lined up, think about your own job. If expectations are clear that you're getting from your management, if you're getting pretty good feedback on a regular basis, so you know you're on the right track, if your tools and stuff are working pretty well, if there's some recognition, at least thank you or whatever for doing things well, and we've trained you and we're putting you in a job that at least lines up with your capabilities and interests, you'll probably be a pretty happy camper. So I try to get to the decision makers and the trainers more in relationship to what do you want with your people. So I don't know if that helps answer your question. It's kind of a long and windy question, but those are not having access to decision makers is a challenge. One of the advantages, of course, being an external consultant is I can refuse business. So people come to me and say, sorry, we can't let you talk to anybody. I say, well, I'm sorry, then I'm not going to talk to anybody, am I? I'll go on, I'll find some other business. And you might not be able to do that. Although, again, at some of the larger companies that I've worked with who've adopted performance improvement over quite a few years, and they've demonstrated that they can have a big impact if they get involved. If they say, okay, if you say, sorry, we're not going to play because you won't partner with us, sometimes those people will come back and say, wait a minute. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Bill Blunt, who introduced performance thinking in a big company and then retired a few years ago, first few years when he was introducing it, he used to have stories about when stakeholders or decision makers or some department head or something would come to him and say, Bill, we need some training. He says, well, can I have a little time with you in the room and a slide set or whatever, some flip charts? And he would sort of go through an analysis, a quick and dirty analysis of them about what the important accomplishments or outputs were and what the behavior was, and then sort of some 6 boxes stuff. And very often would come up with some pretty obvious improvements they needed to make in other cells beside the box 4, skills and knowledge. And what he told me was that on more than one occasion, people say, sorry, Bill, just give us the training and we'll deal with the other stuff. And on more than one occasion, a few months later, they'd come back and say, hey, Bill, can you come back? Like some of that stuff you were talking about sort of made sense now. We've looked at it. So it's a process. And I think it's about relationship building. It's about showing small successes like anything else. It's about making sense. And I believe that the plain language and models that we have allow you to make sense a heck of a lot easier than most things. So anyway, that's probably, oh yeah, unionized organizations. Yes, ma'am. Good point. I don't know about that. I haven't worked in many unionized organizations. I have a young colleague, however, who works in a company where one level of people are in one union and then the other people are in another union. You can't do anything to help anybody without getting union approval. So he actually couldn't do his certification project in the company he worked in because nobody was open to anything without the union's approval. So that sometimes gets to be an issue. I'm looking at Don's comment. So context of how people look at this, trying to approach this by performance changes. Yeah, I mean that's right, Don. This is not paint by numbers or a cookie cutter. But what I guess I believe is that these two little models we have, these plain English models, give us an advantage. I find that in most cases, people are willing to listen and they get what I'm saying. They're not offended or put off or don't want to look stupid by some big complicated jargon I have, and that at least opens the door a little bit. And they might still say, we've got that handled, we don't need you. But at least they might have understood what you just said, Yeah, engagement is a really big deal. And I don't know if you've checked it out, Don, but there is on performancethinking.tv, our YouTube channel. I did a session a few months ago on employee engagement, and it was a big discovery for me because we've been saying for years with the 6 boxes that, what I said a few minutes ago, which was, well, as far as we can tell, if the first 5 boxes are pretty well aligned and mostly positive, you'll probably have pretty good attitude on the part of your employees. And when they come into work in the morning, probably they'll be kind of happy campers. But if this other stuff is messed up, if they're getting mostly critical feedback, if there's really no consequences other than maybe punishment for not making deadlines, if the tools stink, if their managers don't give them clear expectations that are consistent, etc., then there's not much you could do to fix their attitude other than redesigning stuff. I have a client, colleague who has a small behavioral health company, and it's been growing pretty fast over the last few years. And she claims that the 6 boxes saved her company. Now, I've always thought that might be an exaggeration, but they used to have a thing where they were holding their employees accountable and all this kind of cliche stuff. And they were having high turnover and et cetera. And then they started using the 6 boxes as a framework for unpacking people problems, whether it was gaps in performance or not ramping up quickly enough or dissatisfaction. And they started using that as their kind of working framework for how they tried to improve conditions. And several years later, they are the employer of choice in their industry, in the region. They have low turnover, et cetera. And so I kind of knew that. But then some years ago, I encountered the Gallup 12 employee engagement survey. And a lot of companies do these engagement surveys that have like 100 items on them. It's like a lot of stuff, But Gallup has been doing this thing for, I think, a few decades. And it's just 12 items. They're things you have to rate them on from not at all to a lot, 1 to 5. And it's like, I know what is expected of me at work. I have the resources I need to do stuff. And their data, there's research showing that the companies who are in the top 25% of scoring across their employee base on this survey are significantly more profitable, have bigger market share, have higher customer satisfaction. I mean, real bottom line results that executives, even the most bloodless executives in the world, will care about. And then I looked at it and I said, oh my gosh, no wonder these items on this Gallup 12 thing fit perfectly into the 6 boxes. So now we proactively teach managers, leaders, supervisors, and so forth. Your job is to arrange conditions using this framework so that the things are aligned and positive, and you're going to have happier employees. Oh, wow, that's nice to hear. Anyway, I could go on and on, as you can probably tell, but we're well over an hour. I appreciate your participation and your questions especially. It doesn't take a few questions, as you can see, to get me going, but there's a lot of depth in this stuff. And we now have, it's these simple models where there's a lot underneath the surface. So I really encourage you all to check out the YouTube channel. And in I think 36 hours or so, this one will also be recorded and up on the YouTube channel, although our video we're between video editors right now, so we'll see how quickly it gets there. But anyway, thanks everybody. I really appreciate your participation.